Isn't this a beautiful sunset? We're looking over a bay called Cardigan Bay in South Wales, kind of like the cardigan sweaters and stuff people know about. But this bay here looks like it's strewn around with rocks that are on the sand, and you can tell that the sand is quite wet, reaching way up here, even though the water is quite a distance out. It doesn't look like common beaches really do look to a lot of people, especially for these rocks that are in there, especially even more if you find out that those aren't actually rocks, but those are submerged trees that have been silted over and pretty much snapped at the base due to weathering and erosion, and that there used to be a forest running out in this bay for quite a few hundred yards. In fact, I believe the figure was 32 kilometers. And it's a gorgeous sunset. We've talked a lot about Atlantis and the concept of Atlantis. In fact, I've made, I believe, 6 videos now on this channel alone referring to the subject and places that we think of that might be Atlantis. There was one a few years back that I did on the Eye of Mauritania because it has a shape that many people have looked at and said that's very conducive to that concept and idea. In fact, almost in the size of it, but this would have to have been way back, and at a time whenever that was more fertile and the land wasn't even as high up above sea level as it was now. So if you take it way back to say 10,000 years, whenever this happened, the sea level would have been so much lower that almost becomes an unfeasible concept, unless you want to go with the idea that there was some rebounding or something that's gone on and that the land there has dramatically changed in its height, which is somewhat a possibility. But also, even recently, I got back into the subject again and talked about a place that's in Spain that's out those Pillars of Hercules and take a right, and that people have noticed, and offshore type places, which is not like this tree forest that you see in front of you, but something that's in the distance that's now quite underwater. I did a couple of vids about the area in Britain known as Dogger Bank in the North Sea, and how they have found certain objects, even made a reference to it when we talked about the Solutreans and they're perhaps coming to the New World a long time before the Clovis type people, which all got wiped out at the Younger Dryas event. But at that time, the sea level was much lower. So much ice was trapped in the continental ice shelves that the sea was some 420 feet lower than it is now. And ironically, this bay that we're looking at here, which is somewhat shaped like a crescent and is filled up with water, in ancient times, from the farthest reach of the left poking out of the crescent to what's unseen even in the picture to the farthest right, is less than that height below sea level now. And so it leads to a credence that there perhaps might be truth to a story of another Atlantean type place that we're going to look into. Whenever I was a kid, let me preface this, and studied it, most everybody was correlating it to an idea that there must have been some islands somewhere out the Pillar of Hercules, in between that and the Americas. And the only place that's huge enough to be said that's as big as Asia and Libya combined would have been the Americas. But you know, we look at old maps and things, and they didn't know that Libya, which is the first name that we have recorded of Africa, and it was all called Libya, that it was really as big as it was. All the old maps show that it cuts off at the Sahara. They're not unsure, or they're really unsure. In fact, there were voyages to go around there, and they actually broke the barrier of the median and the equator, and the sun started being on the other side, especially whenever it was summer in the northern hemisphere, to the Phoenicians that were rounded there in Hanno and the things. But the Greeks didn't even believe that idea. They were like, what? But also, they may have played it off because it was kind of a secret once they finally found it out. But if you take that idea and the idea of ancient Asia Minor, which is Anatolia, and Asia, as they called it, which is a huge expanse encompassing basically Russia all the way down to India, even cutting through China, and all the way back across to the Mediterranean, there could be no land that's anywhere near that size. So one has figured out long ago that if this story is true, there is something missing, exaggerated, or in some way incorrect with what we currently can find in front of us. And the only possibility that it could be, other than it being the Americas somehow, is that it was actually all the coastal areas outside the Pillars of Hercules, including Doggerland, and this one we're going to talk about here, and others, which were submerged, leaving behind islands. You see, because they refer to it as a Greek tale quite often, but if you'll understand the idea that goes behind it, it was not a Greek tale. It was something that a Egyptian priest named Solon told to his grandfather, and it had been passed down. Now, I've got some stories from my granddad that he tells, and I've heard a couple of them a few times, so I've heard a little variation on a theme of it. And I'm pretty sure that if I was to go back in time and reach that moment that he told the story about, that it would not be exactly what I thought it was, and something different that is much more in line with what he was thinking it was. And there'd be a little bit of a telephone game just in the problem of Granddad's story to me. So indeed, there could be a problem between his grandfather and him, the original recorder of the tale. You see, because once it gets recorded down, there can't be any telephone game after that. So we have to look at the first portion of that where it's coming through, but also you might omit the idea of the Egyptians somehow giving a candid or false report of such. We have found that the Phoenicians, who were traders out in this area and deliberately lied to so many people on so many issues other than the maps that always showed somehow a dragon or a monster or all these things out in the water and stuff, that they were trading and, of course, fueling the Bronze Age out of Britain and western shores right there. So it's easy to find out that it's possible that this was a Phoenician tale passed down, which may even still be based on truth, in some way, shape, or form, but said in a different way, and of course it's all gone now. What's all gone? It's just a shoal of mud and crap out now. Really, because they start the story by telling you that this is just a harbor and there's a great sea around, and we know that the Sumerians know about the great sea that surrounded the whole continents there that they're talking about. They have it on an old map. No, it doesn't look like an accurate map, but it's, believe it or not, about the first map that we have of anything. Don't want to have to go into the fact that they knew the world was round. It's the reason we have 360 degrees to a circle. And the way tales came out of that too, but you can see how the telephone game through certain people does things. And it's harder to believe that even just from a grandchild down that it does, or that perhaps he embellished the story a little bit to try to correlate it into the fact that they were becoming a great civilization and that they should perhaps wear their how's the word say, wear their civilization leading tout perhaps with a little bit more modesty, because that's kind of what's told in the Egyptian tale, is the tale of these people that lost their modesty and so on, and the gods. And of course the god over the Atlantis was Neptune, and I've been invested in that for a long time, and I wish I could tell you the exact truth of it. My truth that I have found that's the closest idea is that there were a lot of places that these people lived in ancient times, and whenever it all flooded after the last ice age, many people got evacuated out of that area, and some areas were lost seemingly in a day and a night. Were there volcanoes and eruptions and all kinds of things? Yeah, there was a bad thing that happened along with that, and there was a volcano that happened at the time that we verify now also that was going on, and then the Younger Dryas event hit. I want to do another video about it, but it looks like that was the reason we have that jog and then pow and then zap again. There's the double fold hit that happened onto it. So everything kind of went harsh or bad, and then shortly after that, you thought that was bad. Here comes Devastation Incorporated. And not only was the Black Sea inundated all around it, but of course all the flooding from all of the rivers that came down that everybody was living around everywhere, not just on the shore here, would have been flooded out, and not for a year, but repeatedly over and over again, to the point that they had to move so many times, and then here it came again, and again, trying to wipe it out. And in a way, it wiped out a lot of it and smeared the land clean, scoured it under. But then also, because people were so coastal back then, the shore that they would have been on was 30-something kilometers out to sea now. The way I understand this bay, at 30 kilometers out to sea, there might have been a couple of pockets where the water was coming in here and here, but basically this gigantic bay that they have there would have all been land at one time. And no, it's not even as big as Doggerland. But you start adding up all these places, and it makes some sense. Can we find any remnant of that? Well, the reason I laid off of it and didn't show this, because I've known this for a while, is because I've been waiting for perhaps something more to be shown on that ancient site off the coast of the Isle of Wight that's 30 foot below the ocean. And it's a giant pier that's been built there. In fact, there are driven in posts and so on in a configuration that people even to this day recognized, oh, there were bending boards to make boats. Not some straw situation, but already dealing with wood. Is there going to be any situation where you find great stoneworks and things? Perhaps you might find some stonework and some lithic works, but these were also a people that left little trace, for all the wood that they built things out of and so on is long gone away. One tale that comes from this bay right here that I had heard in my teachings, I believe it's the exact same bay here, was that at one time they had a shipwreck, they thought, and this was back in the 1500s, 1600s, they had a shipwreck they thought that had happened near there because after a good storm, which might have caused a ship to wreck, that they had a lot of wood and boards coming up, some of them pretty good size, a lot of other ones seemed to be shattered into pieces, and they floated up onto the shore here, and they got the locals to go out to try to help the people and everything or whatever. And in going out, they found some pieces of wood, but they never found a shipwreck or anything of that nature. And the local little idea was that what this was the ancient civilization that had been out in the bay, had been kicked up by the storm, and again, and strangely it says in that tale, it said this is some of the last pieces of the lost remnants of this ancient place we're fixing to talk about, that had been long ago lost below the sea. And it was right out there. In fact, the name of that place was kept until modern times. So let's look into this and go away from this sunset. It's called Cantre'r's Gwaelod. It's the mythical sunken kingdom of Wales, or a portion of which. The story of Atlantis is one of the most renowned and enduring tales from ancient Greece. This island, mentioned in the works of the philosopher Plato, was said to have been swallowed up by the sea and vanished. Yet the story of Atlantis is not unique to the ancient Greeks, as other cultures also have similar legends of land masses that disappeared under the waves. One of these is the story of Cantre'r's Gwaelod from Wales. And so it's Plato, but no, it's actually his granddad, and then he found it out from these people too. And were they hearing the tale of Phoenicians and so on? You think if that was the such, that the Phoenicians would have been telling the same thing to some other people. But maybe, I guess it's hard to believe even in modern day that maybe sometimes these secrets did die with people. Cantre'r's Gwaelod, meaning lowland hundred, is said to lie between Ramsay Island and Bardsey Island in the area known today as Cardigan Bay, in the west of Wales in the UK. It is believed that Cantre'r's Gwaelod extended about 32 kilometers west of the current shoreline out into the bay. So looking at this picture here, we can see that these rocks that we were looking at and so on, while there is some rocks that are around, there are trees that are here. And they seem somewhat sheared off, and then we see these giant river pebbles around, and something tells me maybe during the last ice age this place got sheared off by ice and the things that had happened for it, and this forest here was taken out somewhat. But then I think, if I'm not mistaken, it only dates to a few thousand years ago, whenever it finally inundated the whole place. Whenever you're looking out here in the picture, you can see that the water is there and the shimmer and the blue, and then all of a sudden it goes brown again, and way in the distance there you can see the other far shoreline. If I understand this picture correctly, that's one side of the Bay of the Crescent, and the other is to the left, farther away, but you can still perhaps see it way to the left out of the picture here. And that from the farthest reach of that point coming around here, if you will, like my finger coming around here, and then sweeping all around into the place that's way over here, across that spanse and everything in between, was exposed. Prehistoric fossilized trees. During the 6th century, Cantre's Gwaelod was said to have been ruled over by a legendary king by the name of Gwyddno Gwaelod. In fact, up to around the 17th century, in the modern time, Cantre's Gwaelod was known as Meas Gwyddno, meaning Gwyddno's land. I mean, like Meas How, knowing Meas. So, named after this Welsh ruler. An earlier version of the legend associated with Meas Gwyddno asserts that the land was submerged underwater whenever a Myrrid, that's a priestess of a fairy well, allowed the water to mystically overflow back in the time. And this is trying to connect it to fairy stories and situations. And there's about 3 little variations on a theme of this story here we'll go into real quick. A different legend, however, is known today and told today. In this version, Cantre's Gwaelod is described as an extremely fertile land, so much so that an acre of land there was worth 4 elsewhere. The only problem with Cantre's Gwaelod is that it was said to have been dependent on the dike to protect it from the sea. And at low tide, the sluice gates were opened to allow water to drain from the land, and at high tide, the gates were closed. The problem with that situation is that salt inundated areas do not grow fertile crops, and so it couldn't have been something that was going in and out at the time. But that would probably indicate that it was going in and out at the time that the people started telling this secondary story, and at the time they had developed sluice gates. In fact, they were already ancient at the point they were telling this. Still, this comes from thousands of years before that, or it would not have been the forest and the situation that's there. Let's continue. In the more recent version of the story, the watchman that was appointed to look after the gates was a man called Sunken, a friend of Gwyddno Gwaelod and a heavy drinker. According to this story, Sunken was at a party at the king's palace one night when a storm approached from the southwest. As he was either having too much fun or else fell asleep due to too much alcohol, Sunken did not notice the oncoming storm and failed to close the sluice gates. As a result, it is said that the sea rushed in to flood the land, and 16 villages were drowned. Gwyddno and his followers were forced to leave the fertile lowlands and seek living areas in less fertile lands. This may be also a tale of how things got flooded long before from the people that came to this land and associating with something that was kind of going on again later. It would make far much sense, especially whenever names get transferred and things like that from the east coming in and is now in the west. So, in the earlier version, though, of the story, it was not Sunken, but the maiden Myriad who was responsible for watching these sluice gates. So there was a progression of a 1 and then 2 and then 3, and then no, it didn't have to do with fairies. It's just this guy that had it happen, but in actuality of mythology that would break down in form. Sunken was said to be visiting a king who distracted the maiden with his amorous advances, if you will. Once again, the tale of a storm approached, and the Myrrid, who was too busy with Sunken, failed to notice it and was unable to shut the sluice gates, and it caused the drowning of Cantre's Gwaelod, and again 16 villages in it. Here's another view from another point on the bay around as it goes, and in this one I really can't see anything off in the distance at all. Perhaps we're looking at the gap in between, and if we looked more right we could see some, and the left we can see some, but basically everything that you'd see right here used to have this giant forest on it and a lot of people, and apparently at least 16 villages that were submerged and gone at one time, and it was something that happened in ancient times. Some believe in the existence of Cantre's Gwaelod, and there were even plans to carry out an underwater search for this lost land. Remains of prehistoric forest are sometimes exposed in Cardigan Bay during stormy weather, so it scours it back and then it gets exposed. In addition, a wattle walkway with associated posts, fossilized human and animal footprints, as well as some human tools, were discovered in recent years, and the dating of these items, however, suggests that they are thousands of years old, indicating that there was indeed land in the area that is now sea, though this was the case a long time before the reign of Gwyddno Garanir, or the supposed reign of Gwyddno Garanir. That reminds me of another place that I showed that was very much like this not long ago, where there was an upturned stump and then driven posts around in a Stonehenge type built that was submerged out in the water that they were trying to save, in a place not reasonably too far from here. Nevertheless, it's entirely possible that the remains of ancient forest fired the imagination of people who saw them, resulting in the tale of Cantre'r's Gwaelod. It is also possible that the story of Cantre'r's Gwaelod can be viewed as a morality tale. The earlier version of the story is a lesson warning about the dangers of lust, while the later version promotes the virtue of temperance. These changes in the story may be an indication of the changes in the values of Welsh society over time, changing the story. Regardless of whether Cantre'r's Gwaelod existed or not, it is likely that the legend will continue to be told and perhaps updated from time to time with the latest findings. So this lowland 100 that they talk about, let's just pull it up to the top. The lowland 100 is gone now. And others say that that could be something during times of drought that people would crutch upon too, and that's where the story kept going on, that they would say, man, there was this fertile area down here, and even their times of drought, it was never a situation, but now the sea is way up here and flooded in, and a sluice gates can't be going for high tide and low tide. In the original picture we were looking at there, you can see that there's a high tide, low tide situation going on there, and while the sea does pull way out and kind of go to a distance, and you can tell that there would be a large difference. See how the pools of water are up here, so this was submerged, and then at low tide it goes out far like that, but it couldn't have encompassed the area that we're talking about, and the sluice gates would have been way out there, somehow submerged some 30 miles or 30 kilometers offshore. And if it is, then this could have been inundated with anything. It would have had to have been an incredible dam. Yeah, something that would have been mythologically kept, that this thing had gone on. And it's kind of hard to believe that the only remnant that we would hear from about now would be this one situation. But some tales drift away just like a piece of wood it would right now at low tide, and you may not hear about it again if people quit talking about such things. Like, share, and subscribe, and enjoy, and we'll get on to another one. Let me know what you think down in the comments about a possibility that this was a portion, along with Doggerland and others, of an ancient lost Atlantis type civilization. I'm still waiting on that 8,000-year-old boat dock from the Isle of Wight and more information on it. At first I'm looking for just a layout of the whole place, but apparently it's huge enough it's taking years for them to get the expanse of it. Peace.